Good afternoon. Thank you guys for coming. I know Fridays in the afternoon may be hard and you're trying to finish stuff up before you leave and enjoy your weekend. I'm going to be totally honest and let you know that this is a very, very, very condensed amount of information. And I'm hoping that it mostly piques your interest to take advantage of some of the other offerings of the State Personnel Development Grant and Special Education Services. As you both probably know, EdPlan has launched a new, what they call behavior module for writing, for conducting your functional behavior assessments and writing behavior intervention plans. I think Gayla was at the first one in Oklahoma City. And again, full disclosure, it has changed quite a bit from that first session in Oklahoma City. And so we're hoping that the final product that is done for the webinar on March 10th is the best possible version of that training of the new PCG behavior module. So if you have any feedback, if you go see one in person and you have any feedback, please let myself or Janae Tyndall know what it is so that we can make it the best possible training that will live on our website, on the Special Education Services website. Ryan is used to it. Okay, so we are just going to jump right in. Stop me if you have questions because it is a really small group. You can write it in the chat box. You can unmute yourself and let me know. I'm going to apologize in advance. At the last behavior module training, somebody actually was kind of frustrated with the amount of times I say and I know I do it a lot. So if it's starting to bother you, let me know. I'm trying to be more aware of how often I say it and stop myself. And I just said it. All right. Can I get it to work? All right, so today we're going to review the Tier 1 and Tier 2 structures that were discussed in the 2 prior webinars. That's okay. We'll also discuss validity, the internal and predictive validity of the screening measures that we talked about last time and kind of their best use. Somebody had a question last time about validity, and I wanted to make sure that we just addressed that so that you guys, again, had the best possible information regarding screening measures other than office discipline referrals. We'll go over progress monitoring of behavior goals because we ended before I got to that part last time. I didn't talk fast enough. We'll talk about methods to modify interventions and then when to move from modifying Tier 2 interventions to individualizing interventions at the Tier 3 support level. Okay. All right, so last time we talked about the Tier 2, the secondary, that's reducing the number of cases or the prevalence of behavior concerns or issues. It's more focused, intensive, and you provide more frequent responses, teacher responding to student behavior. Tier 1, you developed your school-wide behavior team, school-wide expectations. If you're a district level personnel, you might have a district behavior team to make sure you have consistency across your sites. You also have consistent responding to behavior difficulties outlined for all teachers and staff, consistent responding to the positive or expected behaviors. This is what you see in most PBIS systems that provide school level reinforcement. And then you also have high quality engaging learning environments. Research shows us that the more engaged students are, the less likely most of them are to engage in problematic behaviors. Tier 2, we talked about screening data collection for at-risk identification, and we'll touch back on some of those screening measures in just a second. We also talked about determining if it is a skill or a performance deficit. And then we talked about targeted interventions for some of those skill deficits and for performance deficits. So last time we talked about 2 different screening measures that are free. And the reason we talk about the free ones is because State Department cannot recommend or endorse paid measures. So the ones that we talked about that do have research behind them are the Student Risk Screening Scale. I gave you a few different articles regarding the validity and predictive validity of Student Risk Screening Scale. One thing to remember, as with any behavioral screener, is that the skill of teachers and the experience of teachers might influence their ability to complete these consistently and reliably across professionals. So you want to make sure that if you are doing the Student Risk Screening Scale, you are training all of your staff on how those should be rated, and scored. Any questions? Okay, I keep forgetting to look at the group chat. The next one that we talked about was the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire. This is the one that has a lot of different languages developed, a lot of translations for it, so it could be used with a variety of students who are English learners also. This one is interesting because when you look for validity, what you find is a lot of research in other languages and in other countries. So looking specifically for the United States, validity and reliability in the English translation is what we have here. A lot of them look at the factor structure specifically because the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire has 5 different subcategories or factors of functioning. And the biggest thing to remember if you are going to use the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire is to use the total difficulty scale for screening purposes, because that'll give you the best kind of temperature gauge for student functioning than looking too heavily on those 5 factors. You can use those 5 factors to look at problem identification, but I wouldn't have that be your only indicator of what is happening with that student. Okay. Any questions on Tier 1 or Tier 2 before we move on? No? Okay. So Tier 3 is the tertiary tier. You may also hear it called intensive or individualized support in a PBIS system. In this one, you're not just reducing the number of cases because the problem tends to be more generalized. You're typically looking at reducing the intensity or the complexity of the existing case. And it's most individualized teacher or school response to student behavior. So instead of looking at some of those focused, targeted interventions that you have for Tier 2, like check-in, check-out, or self-monitoring, you're looking more holistically at the child and their data and determining what specific interventions outside of just that behavior functioning they might need in order to be successful in school. We're going to go through progress monitoring just because that'll inform some of your decision making for Tier 3. So you identified the student as at risk, you had the intervention matched to the behavior or function or purpose of the behavior is identified, and then you match your intervention. You identified a goal for Tier 2 once you identify your intervention, and then you're going to create an aim line using the student's baseline data and their goal data. And I'll show you what that looks like. And then you're going to conduct data reviews in relation to that aim line. So once you develop, if it clicks over for me, hang on. I'm going to show you really quickly what that'll look like. So you have your baseline data here for a student, and you develop their goal, and you plot their goal point, and then you map it, the aim line. When you are progress monitoring and collecting student data, you're going to plot that, and you're going to look at the student's progress in relation to their aim line. The reason for this is because we want to look at not just if students are making progress, but we want to know if they're making adequate progress to reach their goal, because that'll give us the most useful information on whether or not we need to increase support for the student or if we can continue with the current intervention. So for this student, for instance, it would look like the student is on the aim line for the first 2 data points, and then by the 3rd, they're under, 4th under, and then they catch up. And this is just a sample. When you're making your goal, you want to use a SMART goal, just like you would for a student on an IEP and their IEP goals. You want it to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. It has to be time-bound and it has to be measurable in order for you to plot it and create your aim line. You also want to make sure that it is attainable so that the student and the teacher who are implementing those interventions can experience success. You also want it to be really specific. This is some of where you're really operationally defining the behavior. You're making sure that if somebody else is collecting the data, it's going to be accurate to what you're specifically looking at measuring. And then relevant is kind of self-explanatory, but we'll go through that anyway. You want it to be relevant because you want it to be tied to what is being problematic at school. The goal doesn't necessarily have to be tied to the most problematic behavior. You can start with one that's slightly less problematic, but that you'll have more success with if that is something that the teacher and the student both need to experience in terms of success. Any questions? Cool. All right. And then, like we said, you evaluate the student's progress in relation to their aim line because you want to make sure they're making adequate progress in order to reach their goal. If they are not making adequate progress, then you have some decision making to do with your data team or whoever is working on that intervention with the student. So you can modify interventions at Tier 2 or at Tier 3, but looking specifically at Tier 2, you can modify interventions within the tier of support. You want to first consider the implementation fidelity. You want to make sure not just that the intervention was implemented as it was designed, but also that the student was able to receive their intervention. So you might look at the student's attendance at school or maybe staff attendance for check-in, check-out. Are they receiving what we said they were going to receive, and are they receiving it at the same rate that we said they would receive it? And then you can modify in 4 major areas. You can modify the duration of intervention. This is more specific to some of those teaching services if it was determined that the student needed some speech language in order to functionally request something, or if there were academic interventions that might improve student behavior. You can look at duration, you can look at frequency, and frequency might include the frequency of reinforcement also. So some modifications for check-in, check-out include a check-in midday, and that would be increasing the frequency. You can narrow the focus. So if you are looking at a behavior that has multiple components, you may look at one component of that behavior and narrow your focus to reduce or improve on that behavioral area. And you can also look at personnel expertise. This doesn't necessarily mean finding somebody else to implement the intervention. It may mean that we need to look at the training that the teacher received on the intervention. I know we don't have a lot of time in schools to provide some of that professional development, especially on some of those plans that we think are a little bit more self-explanatory, but it might be an issue of clarifying some pieces for the teacher who is implementing the intervention. Any questions on those areas? Okay. Just know that there is some research that say there's modification in other areas. These are kind of the broad domains that typically I have used and that have worked with those that I've worked with. If you have some other domains, let me know what they are and we can look at them. Okay. So now moving into the individualized interventions, the Tier 3 interventions for students. You want to determine need. We have to have some decision rules for how students are transitioning from Tier 2 supports to Tier 3 supports. We have to make decisions on why they need more intensive supports or more individualized supports than what they're currently getting. Typically, you provide Tier 3 for students who demonstrate no response to Tier 2 supports and intervention. If you are progress monitoring and they have no progress, not just inadequate progress, but no progress, that would be an indicator that that's a student who might need more individualized interventions, especially if you've modified and looked at the interventions a few times. General rule of thumb is that you want at least 3 data points showing a consistent trend before you increase the level of support. This would be something you want to talk about with your behavior team. Some schools have more data points required in order to transition a student from Tier 2 supports to Tier 3, and some of that is based on your capacity. So like I said, roughly 3 data points of modifications and implementation with fidelity with Tier 2 supports. This may look like you want to make sure that once you implement an intervention, you give it at least 3 data points to work, depending on how you've determined you're going to progress monitor either weekly or bi-weekly. You also want to think about how many times you've modified the intervention to try to make it work or to try to improve the student's response to the intervention. This would, again, be something that your behavior team would determine in terms of decision making. I would say you probably don't want to modify more than 3 times. 2 times is probably what my max would be, because then you're looking at waiting so many weeks and so many months before getting the student the intensive intervention that he or she might need. So during your data review team meetings that you have with that whole behavior team you set up in Tier 1 or at your grade level data team meetings, you want to discuss concerns of the student, concerns about the student, and you want to use your team knowledge and expertise to determine if students need additional or more personalized supports. This is one of the reasons you want to make sure that you have a school psychologist or a counselor on those data teams, because they're the ones who will likely have the most knowledge about not just the data use, but also intervention use for behavior in your school building. Ryan, you're a school psych, right? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. School psychs are a wealth of information. Use them. All right. So when you decide that you have modified as many times as you can, you have implemented your interventions with fidelity at Tier 2, and it is not working for the student, they need more personalized intensive supports, you want to collect data in order to personalize and individualize your intervention to that student's specific needs. This is no longer targeted to the student's behavior and function. It is now intensive and individualized to what is happening in that student's life. So you look a little more holistically at your student. You collect multiple forms of information. You may look at attendance, teacher, parent, or student interviews. You may look more closely at academic scores. You'll want to collect data on the specific behavior, when and where it occurs. You want to do more than some of your office discipline referral reviews. You want to go and observe the behavior and see what's happening in that setting, where the behavior is occurring and what's happening immediately before and what happens immediately after. And you want to collect enough of that data that you can start to see a pattern in what's happening. Some other relevant information you might consider is if there are any precipitating factors or things occurring at home that might be affecting the student's functioning in the school. If the student frequently moves schools and doesn't have consistency, that's something that you might want to look at so that you can make sure that your consistency in the school is there as much as possible. You do want to try to look at information that you have some control over. Attendance is one area that you'll probably want to look at because that might impact the fidelity of implementation of your prior interventions, and that is something that you can provide a specific intervention to. It may be that you can't address the problem behavior in the school yet. You need to address the student's attendance in the school before you have enough time in the school to address the behavior. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. When you are planning individualized interventions, you want to determine if there are other services needed for antecedent interventions. This isn't just those related services, though it can be related services, but you want to make sure that they have kind of their basic needs met. Also, if they have difficulties with social interactions where they need more peer attention, you may want to contrive opportunities for social interaction. You, again, may have some attendance interventions. You also want to look at personalized modifications to existing interventions, especially if they worked to a certain degree, but not enough for them to meet their goal. And you want to make sure that the data you look at in that prior step is letting you know the reason for the behavior. And we talked about that before, the behavioral function. It's escape, avoidance, access to a tangible, or sensory, and very infrequently will it be sensory. Most of your function for student behavior will be tied to escape, attention, or tangibles. And you want to make sure that your interventions are more closely aligned to those functions. If you had check-in, check-out, or a self-monitoring for Tier 2, and the student is actually trying to get access to a tangible, you might modify your check-in, check-out to make sure that their goal at the end of the day is to get access to a tangible instead of reinforcing for attention. And then this is the tier when you would likely conduct a functional behavior assessment and write a behavior intervention plan based on that data. For students not in special education, you can conduct FBAs and write BIPs, but you need to have a lot of communication with the parents about what you are doing, since it is not standard practice or an assessment that everyone is getting, like your literacy screener. Okay. You also want to make sure that you identify some replacement behaviors in addition to your interventions. They need to be functionally equivalent to the target behavior. If a student screams for attention, you want to make sure that you are teaching them how to functionally and appropriately request attention. And then you want to make sure if the student is using that replacement behavior, you reinforce it a lot in the beginning so that they learn that this is a simple, easy way to get what they need. It will become, the replacement behavior will become increasingly more socially appropriate. This is especially true for students who may not have all of the prerequisite skills to engage typically with the world or with others. So you want to make sure that you are not expecting a student to go from this really atypical behavior to a more typical replacement. You may have to have some steps in between, shaping it down to that most appropriate behavior. And then you want to consider if the skill is already in the repertoire. This is some of what we talked about last time with the skill versus will. Ryan, what does negative 200 mean? That's okay. That's fine. I just wondered if it was some cool speak that I didn't know. So you want to make sure that whatever the replacement behavior is, the student has the skill in their behavioral repertoire, or if they don't, that you explicitly teach those skills. And we'll talk about some teaching techniques for explicitly teaching. Every time I click into the chat box. Okay. So explicit instruction, this is involving the teaching of a specific skill or concept in a highly structured manner. During explicit instruction, the teacher clearly identifies the expectations of learning, and this is that general sequence of I do, we do, you do. Keep in mind, this does not necessarily have to happen in one instructional unit. You may spend a couple of weeks on the I do, we do stage with the student before they're able to do it independently. So if it is a skill that they don't have in their repertoire, you want to make sure that you provide a lot of opportunities of modeling and then guided practice with you before you do kind of a gradual release to where they are doing it themselves. You may also look at shaping, and this is the procedure that involves reinforcing behaviors that are increasingly closer to the target behavior. So the example I always use, because it's a simple example, is learning how to do a handstand. You may not go from not working out, not doing yoga or whatever, to immediately able to do a handstand, but you can slowly shape that behavior into what it is supposed to look like. So the first step, you might just be learning how to position your body into kind of that straight line, getting ready to lean over and do the handstand. And so if this was a student, you would reinforce their first attempt that is closer than it was before. And then their second attempt, they put their hands down, and that is closer to the target behavior of a handstand than one was. So you would reinforce that behavior until they can do it to mastery, and then so on and so forth. So you're slowly shaping the behavior into what you want it to ultimately look like. The other example of this is if you have students who, if you think about children too, small toddlers who are first learning to talk, we shape their verbal language by reinforcing their initial approximations. So if you have a toddler who wants water and they start out saying, wah, 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 you give them water, you've reinforced it. And then their next approximation is what, what, what. So you'll give them water for that until they slowly learn how to say the correct word, and it's no longer an approximation, it is now your target. So if you have a student who's learning how to functionally request something, you may provide them reinforcement for their initial approximation of the first word. And this is helpful for students with who are nonverbal also. But if a student says break, you may give them a break with that first approximation. And I'm doing it with verbal because that's the easiest one to do also. Then they may go to want break, then I want break, and then you may be able to shape the behavior into one where they will wait. So now they're requesting, you tell them to wait, they learn how to wait, and you reinforce their waiting of 5 seconds, then 10 seconds, then a minute, whatever that may be. So you're slowly shaping the behavior into what you want it to look like. Okay. The next teaching technique is chaining. This one is used for some of those longer behavior chains. So if you have anything that you can break into a task analysis or break into smaller steps, you can use the chaining technique to teach students how to accomplish that whole task. So this intervention aims to increase or create associations between behaviors in a behavior chain. So if you think about washing your hands, you turn on the water, and then the water becomes a prompt to put your hands under the water. And now your hands are wet, and that becomes a prompt to put soap in your hand, and so on and so forth. So for students, when we're teaching them how to complete a chain like this, we may teach one step at a time to mastery before we move on to the next step. So if you think about making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for a student, we may first have them learn how to take out the peanut butter, and then we'll complete the sequence with them. And then once they can take out the peanut butter to mastery, we'll have them take out the jelly to mastery, and then spread the peanut butter to mastery, and then spread the jelly to mastery, and so on and so forth. Okay? Similar to shaping, but it's not one single target behavior we're trying to reach. It's a sequence of behaviors. Okay? So washing hands is one of the examples. Hang on. I have really poor time management, especially when I feel like people, whatever. Especially when I feel like I was trying to let people have opportunities to talk, so I'm sorry. I want to make sure that you guys have some other resources because this was super condensed. These are the resources that we provided before for Otis, the Iris Center, Cedar Center. We have Ed Plan Pepper modules. Intervention Central, and then Intensive Intervention will also give you the taxonomy of intervention intensification. And they also have a data-based individualization protocol that will walk you through more of the steps of individualizing your behavior interventions. We also have the FBA BIP trainings. There's one in McAllister, February 24th. One in Lawton, one in Woodward. And then again, the one March 10th is a webinar, and it will be, hopefully, the best possible version of this training, and it'll be recorded, and it will live on the SDE website for Special Education Services. We also, as part of the State Personnel Development Grant, because I am just the MTSS Specialist for Behavior, I am not the ultimate expert. Our ultimate expert is Dr. Mary Ann Shepard, and she conducts regional trainings for us on function-based interventions and intensive interventions. And those trainings will take all day because there's a lot of information to absorb, and I kind of skimmed the surface. So the next regional training for both of those will be in Shawnee on February 27th. And PBIS.org has some good resources too. PBISworld.org. Thank you, Ryan. Yes, they do. They do. They have kind of an overwhelming amount at PBIS World. So that's one that you'll want to go through and look and evaluate a lot of what they have. But they're a good resource too. So Dr. Mary Ann Shepard has a training in Shawnee on February 27th. If you would like to register for that, I can get you the direct Eventbrite link. You can also search on Eventbrite for that training. It lasts from 8 to 3 and lunch is provided. And she goes much, much more in depth with identifying function and then tying the intervention and intensifying intervention for students. We also have monthly newsletters on our website. The next webinar series, because I apologize, this was very short today. The next webinar series is on progress monitoring. It'll be a 3-part series going over how to progress monitor how to analyze your data, and then how to make decisions based on that data. And that'll encompass mostly academic data, but it will also be applicable to behavioral data. Okay. And that is all, because I talked very fast and I was trying not to duplicate too much of what special ed is doing and what Marianne is doing. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. If you have any comments right now, please feel free to say them. No? Okay. Well, then we are done about 25 minutes early, so you can enjoy your Friday. Thank you, guys.